Okay, so I think that, most of the people are in from the waiting room. So I want to welcome all of you. My name is Eileen Levinson. I am the founder and executive director of Haggadot.com. And Haggadot.com, for all of you who might not be familiar with it, we are a website where we invite Jews of all backgrounds to find a place for themselves in the Passover story by mixing and matching from different Haggadot from around the world. Believe it or not, we actually have almost 60,000 different takes on the Passover Seder. We have each year we have about 500,000 individuals who come to our site to make their Haggadah. And so we're almost 2 weeks before Passover, so it's our busy season. And I want to welcome Mark Gerson and Rabbi Sarah Bassin here for this conversation. And I'll share a few words on each of their bios. Mark is the co-founder of the Gerson Lehrman Group and has been a founder and seed investor in a variety of companies. He is the co-founder and chairman of United Hatzalah, providing medical care in Israel. His articles and essays have been published in the New Republic, Commentary, the Wall Street Journal, USA Today. Mark also hosts a popular podcast, The Rabbi's Husband, and lives in New York City with his wife, Rabbi Erica Gerson, and their 4 children. And Sarah Bassin is joining us from California, where she is the associate rabbi at Temple Emanuel of Beverly Hills, and where she drives congregation-based justice work. Prior to this role, she was the founding executive director of New Ground, a Muslim-Jewish partnership for change, where she built minority-based coalitions. Under her leadership, New Ground was named one of the 50 most innovative Jewish organizations in the United States by Slingshot Guide, and was recognized by Governor Jerry Brown of California as the state's faith-based organization of the year in 2013. So I'm really honored to have both of you with us tonight. And we're going to talk about Christian Seders, which I know can be a challenging topic for some of us here. So before we get started, we're going to do a little opening ritual that we like to do at Haggadot.com just to center ourselves in the conversation. And so just let's everybody just put your hands over your heart and just take a deep breath. Great. So I want to share a few words on why I called this, why I wanted to host this session. So as I mentioned, I am the creator of Haggadot.com. We invite so much remixing on the Passover Haggadah. And for me, a core lesson in the Passover story is about empathy and welcoming the stranger. And so we make our site open to as many Jews as possible. And we have versions of the Haggadah on our site that could be anywhere from, women's Seders to environmentalist Seders to a Black Lives Matter Haggadah, even a Seinfeld Haggadah or a Star Wars Haggadah. But when we talk about other religions and specifically Christians engaging with the Passover Seder, I have to be honest that it makes me often a little bit uncomfortable. And I know from our promotion of this session that there tends to be a knee-jerk reaction amongst some Jews that it can feel like this is where we should draw the boundary. The problem is that when intellectually, I feel that I'm being a little bit inconsistent. So if I am inviting a Lego Haggadah or a Star Wars Haggadah or a Seinfeld Haggadah, but I am drawing the line at a Christian Haggadah, I have to really ask myself why. And am I taking my values of radical empathy and not pursuing them fully? I also think that in a perfect world, we can engage with each other's rituals as an opportunity to learn from one another and to build empathy and to learn more about each other's stories. I know that we don't live in a perfect world. So I know that this can be challenging, and I'm glad that you're all here. As you'll notice, whereas in our normal webinars, we invite chatting throughout the entire webinar, we're gonna just ask that you hold off on chats now. We've actually disabled the chat, but you can send me questions that we'll we'll take at the end. So with that, I want to start our conversation. And again, I just really thank everybody for coming to this conversation with openness and a willingness to learn. So Sarah, for attendees who might not be as familiar with the Passover Seder, can you give us an overview on how the rituals of Passover developed within Judaism and specifically the Reform movement? And also tell us about what roles you tend to take on professionally as a rabbi and personally at your own Seder tables.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you to Eileen and to Haggadot.com for organizing this. I do just want to start and say that what I share is not shared with the intention of condemning or condoning anybody's practice. What I hope to do is to offer some insight into my perspective in particular, and insofar as that may or may not be representative of larger Jewish insights and experiences, wherever you are in this conversation, it'll just help you tap into maybe what's underneath the surface and in this conversation and why it can feel a little bit more tense. So here's where I'll start. The Passover Seder is the single most observed Jewish ritual. It is observed more than services of people going to Shabbat. It's observed more than keeping kosher. It's observed more than lighting candles or doing a Shabbat dinner at home. This is the most unifying religious practice among Jews, particularly in the United States. Now, the holiday of Passover has been around for a very long time. Certainly, it is referenced in the Bible itself, but it looks very different today than what it looked like in the Bible. Biblically, it was one of 3 pilgrimage holidays to Jerusalem focused around temple sacrifice. And, the components of it were this feast of unleavened bread, animal sacrifice, as I mentioned, and a kind of mandated rest. The Passover Seder, as we know it today, is actually a later rabbinic innovation, a replacement for the temple sacrificial practices that could no longer happen when the temple was destroyed in the year 70 CE. Now, in general, rabbis kind of supplanted the temple-focused worship with prayer and study. And the Seder developed over hundreds of years. The first kind of real outline for it that we had came in the Mishnah around the year 200 CE. This is the first body of rabbinic literature that developed and was codified. So you have in the Mishnah the core symbols of wine and reclining and the eating of bitter herbs and the sweet charoset representing the mortar, the paste. All of this tapping into the retelling of the Exodus story. Now, I'll locate myself here as a Reform rabbi and say that the kind of evolution of Passover throughout Jewish history is actually something that adds to my experience of spirituality rather than detracts from it. For me, the value of tradition doesn't come from whether or not God spoke to Moses and that moment at Mount Sinai dictated that this is what we have to do. The experience of my people adding its layers of conversation and history to it is precisely what adds value. And for me, understanding the historical interplay of how layers got added to the text increases my spiritual access to the Seder. So with most things Jewish, the bones kind of got filled out over centuries, and there were added poems and commentary, and a lot developed in particular in the medieval era, when unfortunately oppression was most severe against Jews as minorities, particularly in some Christian contexts. And I'll talk about how that sentiment lingers a little bit with the interplay of Passover a little bit later. So what does the Passover Seder look like today? Well, as Eileen indicated, right, from the 60,000 different variations of the Haggadah that have developed on Haggadot.com, there are so many different ways to read oneself into the Seder. But the basic elements are as follows. There is a preparation for the hosting of the Seder that involves removing bread products from one's home, cleaning out the house, a kind of spiritual cleaning as well. We prepare a festive meal with a Seder plate at the center that has some core symbols on it that get referenced throughout the meal. And then all Seders start with the Haggadah, the telling, right? This core text that we have inherited. In my context, some is told in English, some is recited in Hebrew. And it's really kind of a more conversational expression of liturgy than you'll have in most liturgical contexts. It's really invited to be a story between generations, between a person and tradition. And, you know, generally Seders can last anywhere from an hour to 6 hours, depending on how in-depth the discussion goes and how traditional the community is around the recitation. But the most beauty for me really comes when we read ourselves into the text. I'll say there's a quite famous line in the Haggadah of let all who are hungry come and eat. And so it's really quite common in the United States for, and I imagine around the world, for Jews to have non-Jews at their Seders today. And this was particularly true for me growing up in a mixed Jewish and Christian context, where my mom is a Jew by choice. So there's always been this space for celebration and the bringing of multiple identities to the table. So that's where I'll start as an introduction.
Thanks, Sarah. So, Mark, I'm curious if you could also share that you have been a fan of Passover for years. You have taught Passover study sessions. Can you give us a little bit of history of how you fell in love with Passover and, you know, to your knowledge, from the Christian communities that you've been in touch with, how has interest in Passover Seders and the practice of Passover Seders amongst Christian communities grown over the years?
Yes, absolutely. Well, Eileen, first, thank you for this opportunity. And Sarah, that was just a magnificent encapsulation of Passover. I mean, from the biblical provenance, 2,000 years of history in 10 minutes, just fantastic and instructive, really great. So Sarah's a rabbi, I'm married to a rabbi. So, but I started my Pesach exploration probably around 15 years ago. I remember where I was having a cigar with my friend Jeff Balaban at Club Macanudo, and he said, why don't we study the Haggadah? And I had never really considered the Haggadah as something to be studied, but he took it out and we began to study. And then what I began to realize with what has become a decade and a half of study is what the Haggadah is. Now, before we understand any book or any other media, we first have to ask the question, what is the genre? And if we look at the Haggadah as a dinner program or an instruction manual or a cookbook or a law book or a history book, we're going to get it wrong. It is a guidebook. Now, what's it a guidebook for? It's a guidebook for the Seder, but it's also a guidebook for life. The Haggadah, I believe, it's the greatest hits of Jewish thought, all encapsulated into one short text for one purpose, which can only be understood in acknowledging Pesach for what the Bible tells us it is, which is the Jewish New Year. The authentic, biblically ordained Jewish New Year is Pesach. It says it shall occur at the head of months. So what should one do with the new year? One should consider, how did we do in the previous year? One should take inventory of ourselves now and consider, what kind of people do I want to be individually, collectively, and nationally in the year to come? And the Haggadah exists to help us ask and answer those great questions of life. And when reading the Haggadah, when considering each passage in the Haggadah, particularly those that are so familiar to every Jew, and for that matter, considering every passage in the Torah from which the Haggadah generally derives, we have to ask the question, how does this passage help me to live a happier, better, and more meaningful life today in the most practical and actionable way? And if we can't come up with an answer, we got to keep trying to interpret until we do, because the Haggadah exists, as Deuteronomy says in the Torah, for your benefit. It's to help us live better, more fulfilling lives. And I think every passage does that magnificently. We just have to know how to read it.
Great. So, what do Christian Seders typically look like, to your knowledge?
Yeah, so I've been, since my book, The Telling, was published last week, and a few weeks before and ongoing, I've been speaking with 2 to 3 Christian groups a day about the Haggadah and about the Seder. And what I've seen is this real thirst for so many Christians from around the world. And I've been speaking to groups from Texas to Kenya, from around the world, to rediscover their Jewish roots, and particularly to rediscover their Jewish roots in the story of the Exodus, because of course that's the predicate for the Haggadah. But there's this deep love of our shared sacred text of the Torah, and particularly because we've been talking about it in the context of the Haggadah, the Exodus. And it's this real love, not only of the text, but I've seen it, I've felt it, and I've shared it with so many Christian groups, this love of the Jewish people, the Jewish state, the Jewish religion, and the Jewish Bible. And so every day I've been studying with these Christian groups to try to understand the meaning of the Haggadah, the meaning of the Seder for all of our lives. And there are now tens of thousands of Christian Seders. No one really, it's been growing so fast and happening so quickly, no one has the data, but there are whole states where most churches can be safely presumed to have a Christian Seder. But when I study with them, they're not using Christian Haggadot. I haven't even heard that reference. They want to know what I use the Art Scroll. We study from the Art Scroll Haggadah, and we just go through the passages. We talk about what all who are hungry come and eat means. Why would we be issuing such an invitation in the middle of the event? All who are hungry come and eat, all need to come and celebrate Passover. The event's already begun. We discuss that. We discuss the 4 children, the 4 questions, everything in the traditional Haggadah. We discuss with the attempt to figure out how is it going to help me to live a better life today.
And so it's my understanding that the structure of a Christian Seder could really vary. So from what you're talking about, there's the study session of the Haggadah, but then there is the Seder that might exist on the first night of Passover. And there are interfaith Seders, there are Seders where the pastor might be leading it, or they might invite Jews to lead that Seder. So I get the sense that it's hard to say what the traditional Christian Seder looks like, because Christians are so different and they're doing it in so many different ways. So I want us to think more broadly about the Seder in general. And I'm curious for both of you, what are the boundaries for you when it comes to remixing the Seder by Jews or non-Jews, right? I've already talked about how Haggadot.com is almost a free-for-all, but I do think as the founder, like, where are we crossing a line? So Sarah, would you like to start?
Sure. So I'll start with this, which, as you heard from my bio, interfaith work is something that I'm very passionate about. And I think that when interfaith work is done well, the exposure to another religious community's practice, ritual, prayer, what have you, is actually an invitation to explore what is present and true in one's own tradition, right? To take what you're witnessing and find out what that language is within your own religious expression and tradition, and that it can be a very enriching experience. I mentioned that we often have a lot of guests of all religions and backgrounds at my Seder, and it's a really powerful experience to see people of all different backgrounds read themselves into the text. One of the most powerful moments I've had in recent years is in exploring this notion of, the ancient Israelites as refugees and fleeing from persecution, and having around the table a Jewish woman from the Soviet Union share what it was like for her when she was 10 years old to leave, what it was like for a Muslim fleeing war-torn Syria, and for a Christian woman fleeing from drug cartel violence in Mexico. It's a really powerful way to bring all of these stories to life that's not specifically Jewish. It taps into what's universal about the themes of the Seder. And it helps to bring to life for Jews this notion that every Jew is obligated to see herself as though she herself came out of Egypt. For me, personally, The line gets crossed when Seders are led, not by Jews, but by Christians or people from another background. So I want to break this down because there are both technical reasons for it and emotional reasons for this feeling for me. I first understand that Christianity was kind of forged in the same milieu as Jewish tradition when we were transitioning from the temple to rabbinic leadership, right? Christianity was emerging around that same time. And I also really understand the symbolism of Jesus as the sacrificial lamb, right? The Jewish community and I don't embrace that interpretation, but I understand the Christian belief that redemption has been brought on by the sacrifice of Jesus kind of superseding the redemption of the Exodus. Now, there's a lingering impact of this theology of supersessionism. The idea that the Christian covenant replaces the Jewish covenant. And that's kind of a separate but related matter that I'll dive into a little bit later. But what strikes me as kind of historically anachronistic and problematic is that the practice of Christian Seders take from this construct of rabbinic Seders that actually developed after Jesus died, right? These Seders came about largely after Jesus was around. And so the reappropriating of a kind of Jewish liturgical text with Christian imagery can be problematic for a lot of Jews. The historian Larry Hoffman says, quote, "Some Jews see this as a co-option since practices within the Jewish Seder, even those that Jesus could never have known because they came into being centuries after his death, are given Christological meaning." So that's the technical end of things. I'm going to admit I'm not a scholar on late Second Temple Judaism. I can certainly point you to sources, the Gospel of John included, that reject this idea that the Last Supper took on the form of anything remotely close to a Seder as we have it today. But I'll just put that in a bucket. Less technically and more on the emotional side of things, I think it's important to acknowledge that there's a particular tension in Jewish-Christian relations around the holiday of Passover. And this history I'm going to bring to the fore again, not to condemn, not to accuse, but just so that there's some level of understanding of what's operating for Jews. Blood libels were really common throughout much of Jewish history in which Christians accused Jews of killing Christian children to use their blood in Passover matzah. And if you think that this is something that, you know, is of days of yore, there have been examples in the 20th century in the United States of accusations of blood libels. Passion plays capturing Jesus's suffering and putting these on display often led to pogroms and mob violence as people exited from, you know, these religious rituals and carried out their anger and frustration at the cruelty to their savior and targeted that towards the nearby Jewish community. You know, frankly, for a good portion of Jewish history, it's actually really scary to be living under Christian rule at the moment of Passover. And so the idea of reappropriating elements of the ritual that were used to affirm our identity and instead centering it on something that's not only foreign from our religious practice, but also on something that happened to be the source of suffering can add insult to injury. And finally, the last point that I'll make here, the kind of general territory that we dance in, as I referred to earlier, is the territory of supersessionism. This idea that Jesus's death and resurrection replaced the covenant with the Jews. And that has at different moments in history tolerated, enabled, justified, or even demanded the oppression of Jews as evidence of Christianity's superiority. So for me, the line that I draw is when Seders are led by Christians rather than by Jews, that's where it crosses the line into disrespect. It is another matter entirely for me of creating a multi-religious space for people to be welcomed into the Jewish ritual led by Jews.
Thank you for the depth of that, Sarah. Mark, what about for you? Where does your comfort, where do you draw the line between comfort and discomfort when you engage in Christian communities who are hosting Passover Seders?
Well, first, one thing I like to emphasize when I speak with these Christian groups is that it's almost biblically mandated that Jews and Gentiles share this night together, in the sense that the last meal in Egypt upon which the Seder is modeled was enjoyed by Jews and the mixed multitudes. It was Jews and Gentiles together. So as we imitate that night, we should invite Gentiles. But there's also another biblical reason to do so that leads into the practical reason. So I like to ask the question, who are the two greatest Jews in the Bible? And the answer is going to be Abraham and Moses, right? What did Abraham and Moses shared? They each had a Gentile best friend and mentor. Abraham's mentor was King Melchizedek. Abraham's about to make what seems like a really bad and fatal deal, fatal for all of us, with the king of Sodom after the battle of the 4 kings against the 5 kings. And literally out of nowhere comes King Melchizedek, the Gentile king of righteousness, Melchizedek, comes out of nowhere and reminds Abraham of who he is. He says, "You are a child of the God of the Most High." And Melchizedek's encouragement leads Abraham in the right direction. And here we are. Melchizedek, in other words, helped make Abraham a better Jew. Then fast forward to the Exodus story, and who was Moses's best friend and mentor? Was his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, Jethro, who Jethro tells Moses, what you're doing, making all the decisions by yourself, is not good for you. He says it's going to tire you out, and it's not good for the people because you're not empowering them. Moses immediately complies, and here we are. We see it again later with the sin of the spies. 2 of the 12 spies say we can conquer the land. One of them is Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, the Kenizzite, the Gentile. So we see this constant theme of great Jewish-Gentile friendship in the Bible. And of course, there's also Amalek, which is the exact opposite. Amalek is the Gentile force that attacks us in Exodus 15 when we're hungry, thirsty, and in mutiny. And Amalek is followed immediately by Jethro to show us that that's not the entire experience and that these things are complicated. No, the practical implications are that whenever we've had Gentiles at our Seder, which we have had every year, except of course for last year, we didn't have any guests, is that it's the Gentile who comes to the Seder with such a new perspective, with such fresh eyes, with the benefit of their experience and their appreciation of something that's awesome to them because they've never seen it before, they've seen it infrequently before. That's a Gentile who very often ends up making the contribution or having the insight that people leave thinking about. So it has very practical and very biblical benefits. Now, in terms of Christian Seder, so I think we all Jews, and particularly in the spirit of all who are hungry, but lots of other things as well, we should invite Gentiles to our Seders and share this great experience with them. Now, Christian Seders, I spoke to a group, Motzi Shabbat, and out of Illinois. They had 700 people 2 years ago at their Christian Seder. I presume they were using a Haggadah very much like I was. I didn't ask them which one it was because they were asking the same questions that I ask in my book. And so I presume they were, I know in this case and in all the other cases, at least with the groups that reach out to me. Now, supersessionists are not reaching out to me. So, and that's thankfully a dwindling force as this great Christian rediscovery of their Jewish roots. And I hear all the time from Christian groups that we Christians are the branch, you're the root. We need to understand our Jewish roots in order to understand who we are as Christians. And therefore, we want to really understand the Exodus story in very much the same way that you do. And I think it's a wonderful partnership. And I also make the case that the idea of partnership between Jews and Christians in creating a dwelling place for God on earth also has biblical provenance. In the 10 plagues, if you're God and you want to free the Jews, what technique could you use? You could snap your fingers and make it happen. Instead, everything God does in the 10 plagues and throughout the Bible after the creation happens in partnership with people. So God teaches us how important partnership is. And that's what I think this great and new friendship between Jews and Christians really is. And it's just been such a blessing, not only to behold it, although certainly that, but just to participate in it.
Mark, if I understand correctly, what you're saying is that the majority of Christians that you've engaged with are using a fairly traditional Haggadah, the art scroll or otherwise. They're not so much riffing off the Haggadah as using the Haggadah itself, or a traditional text by, say, one of our known publishing houses. Would
Well,
that be
yeah,
fair?
they'll often ask me, which one do you use, as asking which one should we use, and I'll say Maxwell House has 50 million versions. It's a very good one. It's very similar to the Haggadah. I mean, of course, the Haggadah, the Art Scroll. They're all good, but when they ask that question, they're just saying, how do we rediscover our Jewish roots in learning the Exodus story, and what's the way to do it? Now, of course, as Sarah pointed out just so brilliantly, it was the point that was made in a session around the telling that I had yesterday with a group of pastors from Western New York. And one of the pastors is a bishop in Kojic, the Church of God in Christ, which is part of the Black church. There are more members of Kojic than there are Jews in the US. And his point is, he says, everyone experiences the Exodus differently. And he said, that's why it's a great story, is because all of our stories exist within the great freedom narrative that is the Exodus. And so the Exodus provides this incredible opportunity for everyone to discover themselves as free people in the story. And the Haggadah just lays it right up for us.
Great. I'm curious, one of the core values of our site is about the invitation for Jews to find themselves in the Passover story and to question the text, to disagree, and to make choices and adaptations about what works, for you. I mean, I grew up also in the Reformed tradition, as Sarah is a Reformed rabbi. And in the Reformed tradition, there are many choices that we make to take the original, the text as written and adapt it to the modern day. I'm curious, at your personal Seders, how do you personally choose between following the text or following an adaptation? How closely do you personally stay to the written word?
So I'll start, because this question feels so real for me. I am a Reform rabbi who is married to a modern Orthodox man. So the negotiation of the Passover Seder in our home is an ongoing phenomenon. And as we say with all of our religious rituals, we usually try it, screw it up, talk about it, and then get it better for next year to kind of meet the two of us, right? He comes from a very traditional orientation where there's a necessity for the recitation of every word in the Haggadah, right, in the original Hebrew or Aramaic. And I come from the angle of, what is the essence of what this text is trying to tell us? What is the message that I am supposed to get at in order to transform the way that I live my life on the other side of this Seder? So we're coming at it with two kind of very different purposes and having to navigate and negotiate those two things. Now, for me, I'm presented with greater dilemmas because there are some things in the Haggadah that are difficult or problematic or out of tune with my contemporary values, right? Including a line of pour your wrath out over your enemies, right? That is not an inclination that I lean towards. So my kind of hermeneutical justification or approach to the text is, what is this trying to emphasize for the main messages that we're trying to take away of freedom, redemption, and liberation? And what within the text, right, as a historically evolving text, is an expression of my people's pain or location in history that needs to be given honor, but maybe doesn't need to be replicated or recited by me as part of my expression. So, that's the invitation of the Haggadah really is, how do you see and read yourself into this story? And, as long as we're being true to those fundamental urges and core aspects of what the values are, then I think it's okay. I think it becomes a little bit more problematic when there's an intentional rejection and redirection of the interpretation of the text. You know, there's contextualization, which I think is important. And then there's, you know, rejection. So this is a constantly navigated thing within my house that is still evolving, as all good Jewish tradition is.
I think that is a really important point, to contextualization versus rejection, right? Not throwing out the wisdom and the tradition just because it doesn't feel, just because we don't want it anymore. But being able to understand it differently and in our times is really the core. Mark, how about for you? How do you make these decisions?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's such a good question, you know, and the first thing just relates to one thing Sarah was saying is when I speak to Christian groups, I emphasize to them, one of the many things we end up talking about is that there's no Hebrew word for obedience. And when there's no concept of something, you don't need a word for it. So there's no, and so let's extend the fact that there's no Hebrew word for obedience to your excellent question. It's the essence of a Jewish story, and I have a chapter in the book on this called The Unfinished. The essence of a Jewish story is that it's not finished, which is why there are 5 expressions of redemption and 4 cups of wine, which is why we finally get around to telling the story of the Exodus in the Haggadah. We do so from Deuteronomy, and we skip the part about the farmer and the farmer's declaration getting into the land. This is why Moses doesn't get to the promised land. A good Jewish story, a real Jewish story, cannot end. And so one of the points about that I make in the book is that therefore a good Jewish goal is one that we cannot achieve in our lifetime. So what are the implications for the Seder? You can't finish the Haggadah at the Seder. You can't finish any good Jewish story, so why should you think you can finish the Haggadah? It can't be finished. So if we accept the premise that we will never finish the Haggadah at the Seder, and therefore we shouldn't even try, what should we do? So I said, so the book has about 55 or so chapters, all of which, or most of which reference a passage in the Haggadah. I say pick 2, 3, 5, no more than that, because the time is short, passages in the Haggadah that will really resonate with the specific guests who are going to be at your Seder, and have them prepare beforehand, and then have really robust discussions about the existential meaning of those passages from the traditional Haggadah in their lives in the most practical and actionable ways, and make that the focal point of the Seder, so that when your guests leave, they say, I've learned so much from the discussion we've had about what the Jewish tradition has to help me live a better, happier, more meaningful New Year. Here are 2 or 3 things I'm going to do based upon what I learned. And if that comes at the expense of some of the rituals towards the end of the night, so be it. There's no notion of finishing. So if we can't finish, and if we pick 2 or 3 things this year, and that's all we do, that's phenomenal. Then just pick 2 or 3 different things next year. And there's so much, and it's so rich. As I wrote the book and as I studied, as soon as I completed the book, I said, I didn't finish the book, I submitted it. I didn't complete it, I submitted it. And then a week later, I opened up a doc with things I'd learned subsequently. So there's no notion of finishing it. One should just identify a couple of things that can be meaningful for the specific people there and go with that.
Mm-hmm. I think that that makes so much sense. And I was just having a conversation with a rabbi that I really respect yesterday. He's a little bit of a rebel, but he was saying, like, the notion that the Haggadah is meant to be read from start to finish at the Seder is just insane.
Right.
Like that is torture, right? And it seems that we're all in agreement here is that what's most important is that you get to the essence of the story, and that we're
Right.
building this. We're figuring out how, Mark, as you've said before, how is this story, how is this text a self-help text, and not just to make ourselves better, but then to make the world better. So yeah, I really appreciate both of your comments on that. So we are going to have some questions, but I have one last question for both of you before we open it up. So obviously, like, my hope is that as Christians become more interested in Jewish rituals, we see a commensurate rise in empathy for the lived experience of Jews and the variety of Jews and our diverse opinions. So what advice would you give to Christians who want to better connect with the Passover Seder, or generally with, Torah, and while still maintaining their Christian belief system? And how might they avoid unintentionally harming Jews in the process? So Mark, let's start with you for this one.
Well, yeah, I don't think it's much of it's a good question, but I don't think it's much of a challenge. I mean, in addition to all the Pesach study sessions I've been doing with so many Christian groups, I teach Torah to predominantly evangelical pastors every Tuesday at noon. And there's just this deep thirst to rediscover their Jewish roots. And I mean, it's not just the Exodus. We did Deuteronomy, now we're doing Genesis. And it's the same dynamic throughout the entire Torah. And at least the Christians that I study with, broadly defined, and all those that they know and influence and are influenced by, it's just this desire to rediscover the truths of what they call the Old Testament. We call the Torah. It's the same book, and same truths. And of course, we have a stopping off point that they don't. But there's this incredible respect and love that has been developing in our time that I think has world historic implications, and that I'm so blessed to be able to participate in, and we can all do so, and just to share in this as we learn this great story together.
Sarah, what are your thoughts?
I think that there's a real beauty for Christians exploring more in depth the meaning of the Exodus to them. It's part of Christian tradition as well, that is certainly owned within Christianity, and that is appropriate and beautiful. I think that when it comes to the Seder itself, this post-Jesus rabbinic practice, for Christians to, in isolation without Jewish leadership, to replicate these rituals and to, I would use a language of appropriate these rituals, just know that you're tapping into a real pain point for the Jewish community, at least many Jews in the Jewish community. So I would say that if consideration of Jewish feeling is part of what is guiding your engagement, that I wouldn't run a Seder yourself without Jews. I would instead attend a Jewish-led Seder, find another way to access a Jewish Seder, and then, go back within your own community and reflect on how those expressions within the Jewish community that you learned apply within the Christian community. And, certainly as Mark is articulating, there's a real beauty of learning from Jewish colleagues. I certainly go to and learn from Christian and Muslim colleagues about the wisdom as they interpret it from their own faith. I have no issues with studying another faith tradition. I think it's done in help and in aid with a member of that tradition. So you're not kind of juxtaposing your own lens on top of it inadvertently. But yeah, I think if part of what this Christian impulse and rediscovering Jewish roots is about kavod, is about respect for the Jewish community, that it's important to tap into that emotional history that Jews are carrying with relation to Passover and Christian and Jewish history.
Right. Yeah, I appreciate that. I think for me, I have to say that I really do want Christians to learn more about Judaism, but I don't want them to just learn about Judaism in the past, right? In the Old Testament, in a way that it informs the New Testament and Christianity. I would love, and I hope that, Christians who are welcome to browse Haggadot.com and see the wealth of resources, I hope that they're able to see just the variety of Jewish opinions and concerns that we have. And, because I think that to learn about Jews from the Old Testament is almost learning about the wrong things about us. Or I'll say, another favorite rabbi once said, if you really want to, the Old Testament in some ways is learning what not to do, right? Because there's some really complicated stories in there, but that's taking us on another thread. But my ask is for Christians who want to participate in Passover and the Seder is to do a lot of listening and to to see all of the ways that we're doing Passover Seders and to attend some Seders led by Jews. Or, you know, in this unusual time, you have an opportunity to virtually attend Seders, right? And then think about what that would mean to host your own. I'm not personally opposed to it. I think we're having a really productive conversation to talk about what it means to host that. So I want to open it up for some questions now. We realize that we're not going to be able to open up the chat for questions. So if you go to the bottom of your screen, you can, down by reactions, you can raise your hand. So if you click on reactions, there's an option to raise your hand. And
I can unmute people as they raise. I think I saw Irene and I see Office. So I'm going to unmute Irene first, and then after her question, we'll do Office. So Irene, go ahead.
Okay. I've been seeing on Facebook several ads for Haggadahs, so-called Haggadahs and other Passover stuff, that if you read the fine print, you see that they're messianic, and the Haggadah they're going to send you is apparently has Jesus evangelical stuff embedded in it. I'd like to know your take on that.
Mark, you want to go first?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, I make the point when I speak to these Christian groups, it doesn't really come up that often because these are the Christian groups that I speak to are devout, largely evangelical Christian, not messianic. And I make the point that in Judaism, when it comes up, which it doesn't often, but when it comes up, that we view separation as holy. And in fact, it's the same concept, and that there should be good Jews, however we define that, and there should be good Christians, however you define that, and that's what it should be. And so I don't engage with messianic groups. They don't invite me. I don't go. I speak to, and I have so many friends and really beloved friends in Christian groups. And no, Irene, it's an interesting question. I'm not surprised those are out there. I've not seen them, but maybe because I haven't been looking. But yeah, no. What I'm talking about are Christian churches. Full stop.
Nothing to add. That totally handled it for me. Thanks, Mark.
So I'm going to unmute Office. You can unmute. And then next, I believe, Andrew, I don't know if you still had your hand up, Andrew L., and then Melanie.
I am Jenny, and I am Jewish, and my husband is Lutheran. And we were at his church, and I was having a conversation with somebody, and I said that that we're a mixed marriage. And she said, "Oh, my husband and I are a mixed marriage as well. I'm Catholic, and he's Presbyterian or Methodist or something." And I thought that was funny. We're inviting this family to our Passover Seder. And it's our tradition every year to have Christians at our Seder. And I have this person who's coming as a song leader. And so I wanted to incorporate a song from the Christian faith at the Passover Seder. And my husband, the Lutheran, had a fit. And he said, "You cannot do that." He said, "That is so wrong." And I said, "What's the problem if I have one Christian song?" So how do you feel about that? Who's right?
So I don't speak for all of Judaism. I am one rabbi. I think the integration of a Christian song, right? If it elucidates something within Jewish tradition and kind of expands that conversation, is a beautiful and a great addition. And, you know, a lot of Jews don't register that go down Moses, way down to Egypt land. That's not ours.
Right.
Right. That's something that we have brought back into Jewish tradition because it brings to life the story. And I'm getting goosebumps just singing it, right? And in a really powerful and transformative way. Now, I wouldn't necessarily choose a song that is centric around Jesus and around Christ as Messiah, right? But there's plenty within Jewish tradition that I think of religion like languages, right? Like, you know, French is really good at expressing certain concepts with additional nuance, and so is Hebrew, right? And there's something beautiful about exploring a French word and then thinking about, well, okay, what's the Hebrew equivalent? What's the English equivalent? What is this getting at within my tradition, right? So like the borrowing of a word or a song, right? And then allowing that as a place of exploration and interpretation, I think can add a tremendous amount to the Seder.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's such a great response. I would say though that I would agree. Like this, it's a Jewish event. Like there should be Jewish songs at the Jewish event, and it's a Jewish event. And by the way, none of the Christian groups I speak to have ever talked about bringing Christian songs in. It's a Jewish event. Now, Go Down Moses is very interesting, and it's of course a slave spiritual. But you know, two things about that, if we don't mind a little aside. We're talking about the Haggadah, so why not, right? I mean, two things about that come up in my book and in a lot of the talks. One is that it's a beautiful song, but it says let my people go. But the biblical text always says, let my people go so they might serve me. Freedom always has a purpose. So as beautiful as the song is, and it is magnificent, particularly the Paul Robeson version, it's always let my people go so they may serve me. Thinking about that let my people go song. And but freedom has to have a purpose, which is one of the great lessons of the Haggadah. And one of the great opportunities of this New Year celebration is to try to ascertain what is my purpose as a free person. Secondly, I have a chapter in the book called The Greatest Seder of Them All, because the idea of the Seder is to relive and retell the story of the Exodus. Who did it best? American history. American history is one big Seder. It's one exercise in reliving and retelling the story of the Exodus. So when Sarah speaks so beautifully of these songs, I have in the book, I said, is America a Judeo-Christian nation? Perhaps, but it's really a Mosaic nation. And Moses is the central character in American history. And that was a Mosaic song, is that when Americans have yearned for freedom, it's the Exodus that has been the inspirational text that they've turned to, that we've turned to.
So I am gonna invite Melanie to ask her question.
Yeah. Okay. Hi there. Yeah, I'm so glad you brought up Go Down Moses. I'm an African American. I'm a Christian, and I first started bringing a little Passover into my Easter maybe about 30 years ago. The very first Seder I ever attended was an interfaith service at Riverside Church. And I believe the rabbi was a woman, probably Reformed. She's one who led it. Now, I have led my own Seders privately among my family and friends, usually in connection with Easter. But I do want to speak about the African-American connection to, I'll say what I have to say and you guys can comment. The African-American connection to the Exodus story. Like slaves in America probably didn't know very many Jews, but we got exposed to the Bible, and many slave owners wanted to use certain passages of the Bible to suppress us, but we saw that Exodus story, like Go Down Moses, Steal Away, things like that. And one thing that bothers me is that our country does not expressly celebrate the liberation from slavery. The closest thing we have is Juneteenth, which until this past year was not really that widely celebrated, but I think this year took on special significance. But anyway, I guess I want to speak to myself as an African American and as a Christian, identifying with the Exodus story and even incorporating the Seder, incorporating the Passover. And I've been to many kinds of Jewish Passovers. I've been to Messianic Seders as well. I've been to interfaith. I've been to things in people's homes. So I guess at this point, I said what I wanted to say, and you guys can respond to what I've said.
I would actually like to respond, Melanie. Thank you so much for your comment. This is something that I've really thought a lot about this, especially in the last question. I think so often Jews are sampling from African-American spirituals and not giving them their full credit. Or when Jews bring up the relationship of, say, Abraham Joshua Heschel in the civil rights movement, it almost becomes lip service to this superficial relationship. And I think that we have a lot of really interesting content on the site, and we are reaching out. Actually, we're planning a session in about a week and a half with Jews of color to speak about how to center their experiences in the Passover story and being at the intersection of really, at these identities. So I just want to say, Melanie, thank you so much for bringing that up. I do believe that we need to give more credit to that. I also want to say that, when I thought about Christians adapting and interpreting the Seder, I especially did think about African Americans, and I wondered in my mind, does that make it different? Because understanding the relationship of being from one oppressed community to another, and the power struggles that are involved, right? So as Sarah mentioned, it can be painful for Jews who experienced anti-Semitism and pogroms or family history of surviving pogroms to then see Christians adapting our rituals. But with African Americans, the parallels in our stories are so similar. I once met an artist who was adapting the Passover Seder as a specific, as a recognition, a liberation ritual for slavery. And I'm hoping that we can get that on the site. We also were really grateful to receive this summer around Juneteenth. A couple organizations sent us their Juneteenth Haggadahs. I believe there was a Jews of color organization. So we are going to email you after this, and we'll try to include that. And so thank you for sharing that. Mark, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I was going to say, well, Melanie, first, thank you for such a profound insight and statement. I was fortunate about 2 years ago to have over for dinner Bishop Glenn Plummer, and he is the Bishop of Israel from Kojic, the Church of God in Christ. Talk about this is the love of Israel and the Jewish people, that the Church of God in Christ has an ambassador to Israel. And so he told me about the practice of watch night, which is on New Year's Eve every year, the African American church has a service to commemorate the transition from slavery to freedom in 1863, because that was the moment when the Emancipation Proclamation took effect. And that service is called Watch Night. So I took out my Bible, which he, of course, knew. We looked at Exodus 12:41, Leil Shemorim, the night of watching. It's the night when we went from slavery to freedom. It's exactly the same experience being celebrated with exactly the same term in a very similar way. So it's just a profound confluence of religious experiences that we have around the same event using the same term.
I want to hold up what Eileen offered in terms of the importance of the role of Jews of color in this conversation. And this is something that the American Jewish community, which there's a lot of use of the language of Ashken normative, right, of kind of white Eastern European centric, that has dominated Jewish institutions over the last, since we've been around in the United States, really ignores the existence and value of the community of Jews of color, which is now estimated to be 12 to 15% of the American Jewish population. This is not an insignificant part of who we are. So, that wrestling within the Jewish community is really starting to happen now of, not saying Jews are white and we're borrowing from Black experiences, right? But to look at authentically where is that space within our community of the overlap of those two experiences. The other thing I'll say is, if there's any community that has an authentic access and claim to the story of the Exodus in our contemporary world, it is most certainly the African American community. So I want to uphold that and honor that. And this is where I would make the distinction between the appropriateness and ability to own the Exodus as authentic to tradition versus the owning of the Haggadah, right? Which is a particular line of Jewish interpretation about that Exodus that comes after. So, the kind of earlier statements that I made of those pain points, I think still apply. But what you bring to the surface is reflective of a lot of the work that the Jewish community in the United States is starting to hold a mirror up and face some of the internal work that we need to do.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And thank you for having this session. This is wonderful.
Thank you. I want to be respectful of our panelists' time before I call on any other questions. Are you both okay for one or two more questions?
Absolutely.
Okay, great. So then, Ken,
Thank
I'm
you.
going to invite you to unmute, and then we'll
Okay.
close it out with Dave.
Hi, so I teach 8th grade and 7th grade at a religious school at a Reformed congregation in Maryland. And last night I had a long talk with the kids just about ways that different people look at Passover. I talked a little bit about Christian Seders. I talked a little bit about how many times Musa, Moses is in the Quran, and they were fascinated. I mean, they knew nothing of it. They figure the Seder is ours, period, that's it. And not that I know that much about it, but it just, when I saw the post for this, I wanted to tune in because I really want more background. What would be a good direction to take them in? I mean, most of the kids are interfaith families. They're, they come to our synagogue for a few hours of something Jewish a week. I want to make sure to give them that, but not keep it so exclusive and find some way of tying them together.
So let me jump in here. Having grown up in kind of a mixed faith background with my extended family on my mom's side all being Christian, I grew up as a Jew. I knew I was a Jew, but I went and I celebrated Easter and Christmas with my Christian family, and my family kind of gave me the language of this is not yours, but this is something that we value and respect, and there is something to learn from it. So as I got exposed to the way that my Christian family engaged with their religion and saw such a beauty in how they understood forgiveness, right? There's a robust language in Christianity around forgiveness that I just don't think Jews are as tapped into in our tradition. That made me really curious to go figure out what that language was within Jewish tradition. So as you're engaging with these kids, Moses is such a perfect example, right, of this kind of universal point of access among the monotheistic traditions. And by the way, in the Quran, Moses is named more than the Prophet Muhammad himself, right? Moses is such a central figure in Islam. To encourage your kids as an exploration of their own identity, to ask who these people are in other people's, right? What does Moses mean to your Christian friend? What does Moses mean to your Muslim friend? And hopefully what that does is then spark a curiosity for those kids to explore more within their own tradition and to educate themselves of where Judaism is and what their relationship is to Moses.
That's a great idea. Yeah, I began the discussion, who's Musa? And, they didn't know what I was saying. And then once we kept going, I mean, they were, they're post-bar mitzvah, they're choosing to be there.
Right.
And it's, I want to throw things at them that they haven't been talking about before. So, and honestly, it's been fun for me. I'm learning every step of the way. So thank you.
Yeah, I mean,
All right.
it's, oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, no, it's, well, Ken, I mean, thank you for your question. I mean, I think one of the great things about Passover for the kind of young people you're talking about is, and Sarah, I'd be curious to know your response. On the podcast, The Rabbi's Husband, I'll sometimes ask the rabbi, if someone were to come to you and say, I'm going to go to synagogue twice a year, or I'm going to do 2 Jewish things a year, what would it be? It would not be Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, right? No, I mean, I pick Pesach. By the way, everyone picks Pesach, and then it gets split between Purim and Sukkot, and Shabbat is a definite. But Pesach is such an opportunity both to be joyous. In fact, the Torah commands us to be joyous. Pesach's an opportunity of joy, and it's an opportunity for learning. So it's a great way to access the Judaism within each of these kids. And I was going to say, if you want me to come this weekend and teach a Pesach study session based on the book, I'd love to. So just, if we had a chat, I'd put the email in it. But email me at mark@amhf.us.
Are you busy next Wednesday night?
I'd love to come. I'll check. Well, Wednesday the 17th.
Mark at AM.
HF. You do 6 o'clock. Yeah, amhf.us.
And a
Okay.
shidduch is made.
Right.
amhf.s.
US.
Yeah,
US.
the class is from 8 to 9 on Wednesdays.
Well, we'll talk. I'm actually booked down.
Okay.
Maybe the next week. Yeah, it's amhf.us.
Alpha Mary Harry Frank.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
So our last question is from David. And in full transparency, I'm going to tell you all that he is my husband.
Yeah, I'm not the rabbi's husband. I'm the Haggadot webmaster's husband. So I just wanted to ask a question that was, so I mean, Sarah, you said that, you know, one of your boundaries, one of your lines is to say, Christians, you don't want Christians to be leading Seder. Christians shouldn't be leading Seders, right? They can come in to a Seder that is led by a Jew, take things back to their community, work through them in their own faith tradition. But that doesn't seem to be a boundary for you, Mark. I mean, it seems like you talk with a number of groups that are Christian groups, and they host themselves these Christian Seders for their own community. So I wanted to ask, I mean, one of the reasons why it seems to me Sarah was insisting on that is because of this painful history of sort of, you know, Christian oppression of Jews, particularly around the celebration of Passover. And so I wonder if you think for these Christian groups that are hosting Passover Seders themselves, do they have any sort of responsibility to address and account for this historical oppression that Jews have suffered at the hands of Christians, particularly as it relates to this ritual that they are now taking on themselves?
Well, okay, so it's a very good question. I think the first thing we could do is go to Deuteronomy 24:16. Parents are not to be put to death for their children, nor children put to death for their parents. Each will die for their own sin. So a Christian attending Seder now cannot take responsibility for what someone did in the 1600s. And Sarah's examples were right. I mean, in the book, I talk about how Passover was historically a time of terror for Jews. So much so that there were times in our history when we couldn't use red wine because there was a rumor going around that was acted upon that the red wine was the blood of Christian children. And therefore we used white wine. It didn't even work, by the way. But we're beyond that now. We're in a new time. And part of what we have to learn about Pesach is to approach in the spirit of newness. And I have a chapter in the book on newness. And we're in a new time. And the Bible tells us exactly how to deal with that new time. Each will die for their own sin. Now, of course, when we, and I discuss this in the context of the passage that references Amalek, about for not only one has risen to annihilate us, but in every generation they rise up to annihilate us. And so we talk then about Jewish enemies historically and currently. And the Bible tells us in Exodus 15 exactly that. And in every generation there has been one who rises up to annihilate us. So of course that'll come up in the context of that passage. That being said, I always counsel, let's couple that passage as the Bible does, going right from Amalek to Jethro. So it's this great friendship that we now have with Christians that really should be emphasized. And so I don't think someone has to account for what Christians did in this. A Christian now does not have to account what a Christian did in the 1600s. I mean, from a historical perspective, I have in the book, it's important to know it, but account for it in any personal way, no.
So I'll jump in with a contrasting opinion. You know, as a Reformed Jew who does really value the way that history evolves and adds and transforms tradition, to not take and acknowledge and wrestle with that past, I think is a missed opportunity for Christian growth and self-reflection.
And I
Yeah,
wonder,
one of the points that I make when I discuss with Christian groups, that I say it is an absolute miracle that we're here today studying together. I say, forget the technology. Our grandparents would not have been able to contemplate Christians and Jews studying together to get shared truths out of our shared sacred text. And it's a miracle, and we should embrace it and love it and keep doing it, and just realize how new and how rare and how blessed it is. And of course, that's contrasted. If you say it's new and rare and blessed, then previously there was something very different. So that's acknowledged, but it's this, we're living in this great moment of Jewish Christian friendship, and it's just such a time to appreciate.
yeah, I think I think you're both right, quite honestly, and I'm grateful to you both, because I think, yes, Mark, to me that completely makes sense, that we are in a time of friendship like no other, and yet obviously the millions of Jews in the world are not necessarily going to watch this session, although we hope they do, because this has been fantastic. It seems that a lot of Jews still have that pain and are still needing some assurance that this friendship is in good faith, and one that embraces us who we are today. So that's probably another conversation, honestly, for us to have at some point later. And I would be thrilled to speak with both of you again. This has just been wonderful. We are going to close, and I really appreciate both of your generosity of time, and especially for going over. I, for one, have learned so much here, and I feel that we have provided a lot of information for everybody here to be able to think more deeply and reflect on your own, and ultimately make decisions about what makes sense for you and the people around you, and how do we build the relationships of empathy and host rituals that bring in our truest selves. And so we're going to email these resources afterwards to all of you. And if this session was meaningful, I encourage you to share it to your friends. We'll share the recording. I also want to say that Mark's book is filled with so much great information. I don't know if I gave it a proper mention in the beginning, but it's The Telling. And we're actually giving that away to donors of our site. Our site is a nonprofit. We are completely supported by our users. We're almost like a public radio where we provide this service, and we want to make it for free for everybody to build this empathy that we value so strongly. And if you can donate, great. If not, don't worry about it. We're still happy to provide this for free. So with that, we have a fun ritual that we end with in all of our sessions. I know we can't see each other, so Mark and Sarah, you're going to have to do this with me. We put our hands in the middle, and even though this has been a really deep, serious conversation, we're still going to do this and put our hands in the middle, and on the count of 3, we are going to break and yell Seder and wave goodbye. So thank you all. Thank you, Mark and Sarah, and everybody who came with such great questions and patience. And 1, 2, 3, Seder. All right. Thank you all.
Thank you.